Title: A thief robbed an elderly woman on the subway without realizing Chris Evens was watching. Part 1. A quiet ride that took a turn. Chris Evens sat quietly on a worn subway seat, his baseball cap pulled low, and a simple hoodie hiding his famous face. The rhythmic sound of the subway wheels on the track created a soothing backdrop, mixing with the quiet murmur of passengers. Chris felt a rare peace. There were no cameras, fans, or lights, just the chance to feel like a regular commuter. The faint smell of metal and leftover fast food hung in the air. Chris leaned back, his eyes half closed, enjoying the simple anonymity. For once, he wasn't a celebrity, he was just another person on the subway. But the calm didn't last. The subway jerked to a stop, and a group of new passengers entered. Among them was a young man in a gray hoodie, his face partly hidden, his sharp eyes scanning the train. Chris noticed him right away. His energy was restless, almost jittery, like someone searching for trouble. Then Chris saw her, an elderly woman named Clara Rivers. She looked like she was in her late 60s, carrying a large handbag close to her chest. Her cautious steps and tired eyes showed her age. Clara shuffled onto the train, searching for a seat, but no one offered her one. Chris clenched his jaw as he watched her. She looked hopeful, glancing at the seated passengers, but everyone avoided her gaze. Her shoulders slumped slightly in quiet disappointment. Chris thought about standing to offer his seat, but before he could move, the young man in the hoodie stepped forward. At first, Chris thought the man was going to help Clara. But then everything changed. Justice and reflection. The subway rumbled forward, the tension in the car as thick as the smell of stale air. Chris stood firm, his eyes locked on the young man lying on the floor. Clara sat nearby, clutching her bag as if it were her lifeline, her trembling hands finally beginning to steady. The passengers who had once been indifferent were now watching with a mix of guilt and awe. Phones were still out, but the focus had shifted, from idle spectatorship to capturing what they would later call a moment of bravery. The young man on the floor muttered something inaudible, his voice dripping with bitterness. "Stay quiet," Chris said coldly, his gaze unwavering. The train began to slow, and the intercom crackled. "Next stop, Central Plaza. Please stand clear of the doors." As the train came to a halt, the faint wail of sirens could be heard outside. The doors slid open with a hiss, and the metallic clang of approaching boots filled the silence. 4 uniformed police officers entered, their sharp eyes immediately finding the young man sprawled on the ground. "What's going on here?" asked the lead officer, his badge glinting under the fluorescent lights. Chris stepped back slightly, gesturing toward Clara. "This man harassed and robbed her," he said simply. His calm, authoritative tone left no room for doubt. "She can tell you the rest." Clara's voice, though soft, carried a newfound strength as she recounted the events. The officers nodded, and the lead officer motioned for the young man to stand. "On your feet," he barked. When the man hesitated, another officer yanked him up and cuffed him with a practiced motion. The clink of the handcuffs echoed through the car, and the young man's bravado vanished entirely. As the officers escorted him out, one turned to Chris. "Thanks for stepping in." Not everyone would have done that. Chris gave a small nod, his expression unreadable. "Just doing what anyone should," he replied. A moment of quiet. As the train resumed its journey, the atmosphere in the car shifted. The tension eased, replaced by a quiet sense of relief. Passengers murmured among themselves, some offering Clara kind words, others stealing glances at Chris with a mix of admiration and curiosity. Clara turned to him, her eyes glistening with gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you," she said softly. "If you hadn't stepped in?" Chris met her gaze, his expression gentle. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "No one should go through that alone." For the rest of the ride, Chris sat quietly, his presence a calming force. The subway car, once a scene of indifference and apathy, now felt united, at least for a fleeting moment. When the train pulled into Chris's stop, he stood and adjusted his hoodie. As he stepped toward the door, Clara called out, "Take care, young man." Chris paused, turned back with a faint smile, and tipped his cap. "You too." The doors slid shut behind him, and as the train pulled away, Chris disappeared into the crowd of the bustling city, once again just a man blending into the ordinary. Justice arrives. The train screeched to a halt at the next station, the doors hissing open. The sound of boots against the platform echoed as 2 police officers stepped onto the train. Their sharp eyes scanned the scene, quickly locking onto the young man lying on the floor with his hands behind his head. "What's going on here?" one officer asked, his voice authoritative but calm. Chris gestured toward Clara, who was clutching her bag tightly, her face pale but composed. "This man harassed her, stole her bag, and shoved her," Chris explained. "I stepped in to stop him." The officer nodded, his gaze moving to Clara. "Ma'am, are you okay?" he asked gently. Clara nodded, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I'm fine now, thanks to him," she said, her eyes briefly meeting Chris's. The officer turned to the young man on the floor. "On your feet," he barked. When the man hesitated, the second officer grabbed his arm and pulled him up roughly. The metallic click of handcuffs followed, a sound that reverberated through the silent subway car. "You're under arrest for assault and theft," the officer stated, leading the young man out of the train. The subdued criminal glared at the floor, his bravado completely gone. As the officers escorted him away, the remaining passengers let out a collective breath, the tension dissipating like a weight lifted from the air. A moment of gratitude. Clara looked up at Chris, her eyes welling with tears. "I don't know how to thank you," she said softly. "If you hadn't been here..." Chris gave her a small smile, his voice steady and reassuring. "You don't need to thank me. I just did what anyone should have done." The other passengers, once hesitant and passive, began murmuring words of gratitude and admiration. A young woman with a phone in her hand approached hesitantly. "Are you Chrisevens?" she asked, her voice filled with awe. Chris sighed lightly, adjusting his cap. "I was just another guy on the train today," he replied. "That's all." The train jolted forward, resuming its journey. Chris sat back down, the adrenaline slowly leaving his body. Across from him, Clara adjusted her bag on her lap, a faint smile playing on her lips. Reflection. As the subway neared his stop, Chris stood and prepared to leave. Clara reached out, touching his arm lightly. "Take care of yourself," she said, her voice filled with genuine warmth. Chris nodded, tipping his cap. "You too." When the train doors slid open, he stepped onto the platform, blending into the crowd as if nothing had happened. But as the train pulled away, the passengers inside knew they had witnessed something extraordinary, one man's courage to stand up when no one else would. Outside, the city bustled on, oblivious to the small act of heroism that had unfolded underground. For Chris, it wasn't about recognition or fame. It was about doing what was right. And as he walked into the fading sunlight, he felt lighter, knowing that in one moment, on an ordinary subway ride, he had made a difference. The police arrive. The train rumbled on, the atmosphere thick with tension. The young man lay motionless on the floor, his breathing quick and shallow, his face pale with humiliation and fear. Clara sat nearby, clutching her bag as though it were her lifeline, her trembling hands a stark reminder of the ordeal she had just endured. The subway jolted to a stop at the next station, and the doors slid open with a sharp hiss. A wave of relief washed over the passengers as 2 uniformed police officers stepped into the car, their sharp eyes taking in the scene. Their gaze landed first on the young man on the floor, then shifted to Chris, who stood tall and unwavering, his expression calm yet commanding. "What happened here?" one of the officers asked, his voice firm but professional. Chris nodded toward Clara. "This man harassed and robbed her," he explained, his tone steady. "He shoved her and took her bag. I stepped in to stop him." The officers turned to Clara, who nodded shakily. "That's right," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He wouldn't stop." One officer approached the young man, his handcuffs glinting under the fluorescent lights. "On your feet," he barked. The young man hesitated, but the officer grabbed him by the arm and hauled him up. The metallic click of the handcuffs echoed through the silent car, a sound that seemed to signal the end of the ordeal. "You're under arrest for assault and robbery," the officer said, leading the young man toward the doors. The subdued criminal avoided eye contact, his bravado completely gone. A subway transformed. As the officers escorted the young man off the train, the passengers exhaled collectively, the tension finally breaking. Whispers of relief and admiration rippled through the car as they turned their attention to Chris. One passenger, a middle-aged man with a briefcase, spoke up. "That was brave of you," he said, his voice filled with genuine respect. Others nodded in agreement, their gazes reflecting a mix of gratitude and awe. Chris waved off the praise, his focus shifting back to Clara. "Are you sure you're okay?" he asked gently. She looked up at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I am now," she said, her voice filled with heartfelt gratitude. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here." Chris gave her a small, reassuring smile. "You're safe now. That's what matters." The train began to move again, the familiar clatter of the tracks filling the silence. The passengers, once passive observers, now seemed united in their admiration for Chris. The atmosphere in the car had transformed. What had started as a moment of fear and hesitation had become a testament to courage and humanity. A quiet departure. As the train neared his stop, Chris prepared to leave. He adjusted his cap, pulling it low over his face, and glanced at Clara one last time. "Take care of yourself," he said softly. "You too," she replied, her voice steady now, a small but genuine smile lighting up her face. When the train doors opened, Chris stepped out onto the platform. He blended into the crowd, just another commuter in the bustling city. But for those on the train, he was far more than that. He had reminded them all of the power of a single act of courage. The train pulled away, carrying its passengers forward. For Chris, the moment was over. But for Clara, and everyone who had witnessed his bravery, it was a story they would never forget. The weight of courage. As the train continued its journey, the atmosphere remained heavy, the earlier tension now replaced by an uneasy quiet. Chris stood tall, his piercing gaze fixed on the young man lying face down on the cold subway floor. Every now and then, the young man would twitch or glance nervously at Chris, but he didn't dare move. Clara sat nearby, her bag clutched tightly to her chest. Though her hands still trembled slightly, there was a newfound resolve in her eyes. The passengers, once passive observers, now seemed more alert. Some whispered to one another, their gazes alternating between Chris and the subdued assailant. The distant sound of police sirens began to echo faintly through the subway tunnel, growing louder with each passing moment. Chris's focus never wavered, his body language making it clear he wouldn't let anything escalate further. Clara mustered the courage to speak again. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here," she said softly. Chris turned to her, his expression softening. "You're safe now," he said, his voice calm and steady. "That's all that matters." At that moment, the train began to slow, the screech of the brakes signaling its approach to the next station. The intercom crackled to life. "Next stop, Central Plaza Station. Doors will open on the right. Justice served." As the train came to a halt, the doors slid open with a hiss, and two police officers stepped onto the car. Their eyes quickly scanned the scene, taking in Clara's shaken expression, the young man on the floor, and Chris standing guard. "What's going on here?" one officer asked, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. Chris gestured toward the young man. "He harassed and robbed this woman," he explained, nodding toward Clara. "I stopped him." The officers exchanged a glance before one of them approached the young man. "On your feet," he commanded. The young man hesitated, his eyes darting around as though looking for an escape. The officer didn't wait. He grabbed the young man's arm and hauled him up, swiftly cuffing his wrists. The metallic click of the handcuffs echoed through the silent car. "You're under arrest for assault and robbery," the officers stated firmly. The young man muttered under his breath, but he didn't resist. As the officers escorted him off the train, Clara exhaled a deep sigh of relief. The passengers, many of whom had been glued to a quiet hero. With the young man gone and the police handling the situation, the subway doors closed, and the train began to move once again. Clara turned to Chris, her expression filled with gratitude. "I'll never forget this," she said, her voice steady now. "You didn't have to step in, but you did. Thank you." Chris gave her a small, humble nod. "It's what anyone should have done." The passengers around him seemed to awaken from their earlier passivity. A middle-aged man in a suit leaned forward, saying, "You've got guts, man. That was incredible." Others nodded in agreement, their expressions a mix of admiration and guilt. Chris didn't linger on their words. He adjusted his cap, pulling it lower over his face, and returned to his seat. For him, it wasn't about the praise, it was about doing what was right. As the train neared his stop, Chris stood, glancing once more at Clara. "Take care of yourself," he said quietly. "You too," she replied with a faint smile. When the train doors opened, Chris stepped off and disappeared into the crowd, leaving behind a subway car full of people who would never forget the day they witnessed courage in action. For Clara, it was the day her faith in humanity was restored. For Chris, it was just another moment of doing what he believed was right. The train slowed as it approached the next station, the hum of the subway tracks momentarily overtaken by the faint sound of police sirens growing louder in the distance. The passengers sat in tense silence, their gazes alternating between Chris, Clara, and the young man lying face down on the floor. The intercom crackled. "Next stop, Central Plaza Station. Doors will open on the right." As the train came to a halt, the doors slid open with a hiss, and two uniformed police officers stepped onto the car. Their sharp eyes quickly assessed the scene: the frightened woman, the subdued young man on the floor, and Chris standing tall like a sentinel. "What happened here?" one officer asked, his voice calm but authoritative. Chris gestured toward the young man. "He harassed and robbed this woman," he explained, nodding at Clara, who clutched her bag tightly. "I intervened." The officer's gaze shifted to Clara. "Ma'am, are you all right?" She nodded slowly, her voice trembling. "Yes, thanks to him." The officers exchanged a quick look before one of them approached the young man on the floor. "On your feet," the officer barked. The young man hesitated but eventually complied, his movements sluggish and resigned. The officer swiftly cuffed his wrists, the metallic click echoing through the quiet car. "You're under arrest for assault and robbery," the officer stated firmly. "It wasn't like that," the young man started, but the officer cut him off. "Save it for the station." As the young man was escorted off the train, the tension in the car began to dissipate. A collective exhale seemed to pass through the passengers. Some murmured quietly among themselves, while others gave Chris a nod of respect. A lasting impact. With the police gone and the train moving again, Clara turned to Chris, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "You didn't have to do that, but you did." "Thank you." Chris offered a small, humble nod. "You didn't deserve what happened. I just did what anyone should have done." Her eyes glistened with gratitude. "Not everyone would have. You stood up when no one else would." Around them, passengers who had been silent or complicit earlier now seemed inspired. A young man near the back of the car spoke up, "That was incredible, man. We need more people like you." Chris glanced at him but didn't reply. He didn't do it for praise or recognition. For him, it was simply the right thing to do. As the train neared his stop, Chris adjusted his cap and stood. Before stepping off, he looked back at Clara. "Take care of yourself." She smiled faintly. "You too." Chris stepped off the train, disappearing into the crowd on the platform. The passengers watched him go, knowing they had witnessed something extraordinary. For Clara, it was a day that restored her faith in humanity. For Chris, it was just another moment of living by his principles. Epilogue. A story worth telling. The events of the subway ride quickly spread. Videos taken by passengers surfaced online, showing Chris's calm yet commanding intervention. The headlines spoke of heroism, bravery, and standing up for what's right. Social media buzzed with praise for his actions, turning him into an unexpected symbol of courage. But for Chris, the recognition didn't matter. As he walked through the city, blending into the crowds once again, he felt at peace knowing he had done what was needed. Somewhere, Clara was safe, and that was all the reward he needed. The train slowed as it approached the next station. The muffled sound of police sirens echoed faintly in the distance, growing louder as the train came to a halt. The tension in the car was palpable. Passengers glanced at one another, uncertain of what would happen next. The intercom crackled, announcing the stop, Central Plaza Station. Doors will open on the right, As the train doors hissed open, two uniformed police officers stepped onto the subway car. Their sharp eyes scanned the scene, taking in the elderly woman clutching her bag, the young man lying face down on the floor, and Chris standing tall, his presence commanding respect. One of the officers stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "What happened here?" Chris gestured toward the young man. "He harassed and robbed this woman," he explained, nodding toward Clara. "I stopped him." The officer turned to Clara. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Clara nodded, her voice shaky but resolute. "Yes, thanks to him," she said, casting a grateful glance at Chris. The officers exchanged a quick look before approaching the young man. "On your feet," one of them ordered. The young man hesitated, his bravado completely drained. Slowly, he complied, rising to his knees before being hauled to his feet. One officer swiftly cuffed his wrists behind his back, the metallic click echoing in the now quiet car. "You're under arrest for assault and robbery," the officer stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. The young man opened his mouth to protest. "I didn't do anything." "Save it for the station," the officer interrupted, steering him toward the exit. As the young man was led off the train, the tension in the car began to dissipate. Passengers who had been frozen moments before now murmured quietly among themselves. Some exchanged relieved glances, others nodded subtly in Chris's direction, their respect unspoken but clear. A newfound strength. With the train moving again, Clara turned to Chris, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill. "You didn't have to step in, but you did." Chris shook his head humbly. "You didn't deserve that," he replied. "No one does." Clara managed a faint smile. "Not everyone would have done what you did." Chris glanced around the car, noting the passengers who now seemed emboldened, even inspired. A young man near the back spoke up hesitantly, "That was incredible, man. You didn't even hesitate." Chris met his gaze and replied simply, "It's what anyone should do." As the train neared the next station, Chris adjusted his hoodie and prepared to leave. Before stepping off, he turned back to Clara. "Take care of yourself," he said, offering her a small nod. "You too," Clara said, her smile now warmer, steadier. Chris stepped off the train and disappeared into the crowd on the platform, leaving behind a subway car filled with people who had witnessed not just courage, but a reminder of what it meant to stand up for one another. For Clara, it was a moment that restored her faith in humanity. For Chris, it was just another day of doing what he believed was right. A story to tell. The videos passengers had taken quickly spread online, showing Chris's calm yet firm intervention. Headlines soon followed, hailing him as a hero. Social media buzzed with praise for his actions, turning him into an unlikely symbol of courage and integrity. But Chris didn't seek the spotlight. For him, it wasn't about recognition or fame, it was about doing the right thing. Somewhere in the city, Clara was safe, and for Chris, that was enough. Justice on the subway. The subway car rattled forward, the oppressive silence broken only by the rhythmic clatter of the train on the tracks. Chris Evans remained standing, his eyes locked on the young man lying face down on the floor. The passengers who had initially laughed or ignored the scene now sat in stunned silence. Clara Rivers clutched her bag tightly, her trembling hands slowly regaining strength. The faint sound of sirens filtered in from outside as the subway neared its next stop. The young man's breathing was shallow, his bravado completely gone. Chris's towering presence loomed over him, a reminder that some actions come with consequences. At the next stop, the subway doors slid open with a hiss, and two uniformed police officers stepped in. Their sharp eyes quickly assessed the situation and locked onto the young man on the ground. Chris stepped back slightly, gesturing toward the young man with a nod. "This one assaulted her," Chris said, his voice calm but firm, pointing toward Clara. "He stole her bag, shoved her, and caused a scene." The officers moved swiftly, pulling the young man to his feet and handcuffing him. He sputtered protests, but they fell on deaf ears. "You can explain it at the station," one officer said curtly as they led him off the train. Clara's watery eyes met Chris's as she managed a faint smile. "Thank you," she whispered again, her voice steadier this time. Chris nodded slightly, then turned to the rest of the passengers. His piercing gaze swept over them, and many looked away, ashamed. "Remember this," he said, his voice carrying the weight of the moment. "When you see something wrong, don't just watch. Do something." The words hung in the air as the subway doors closed behind the officers and their detainee. The aftermath. As the train continued its journey, Clara and Chris shared a quiet understanding. The tension in the car had shifted. Shame and reflection replaced the earlier apathy. Chris sat back down, pulling his hoodie low once again, but the passengers now saw him differently. Clara finally spoke, her voice filled with gratitude and newfound strength. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "But you did." Chris offered her a small, reassuring smile. "Sometimes doing the right thing isn't a choice, it's a responsibility." The train rumbled into the next station, and Chris stood as it slowed to a stop. He glanced at Clara one last time. "Take care," he said softly. "You too," she replied, her voice steady and confident. As Chris stepped off the train, he felt the weight of the moment linger. The world outside was as noisy and chaotic as ever, but he walked with quiet purpose, his head held high. Somewhere, someone might tell the story of what had happened on that subway, but for Chris, it wasn't about recognition. It was about doing the right thing when it mattered most. And for Clara, the memory of that moment, and the man who stood up for her, would be a reminder that kindness and courage could still exist, even in the most unexpected places. A call to action. News of the incident spread quickly, with headlines praising Chris Evens for his bravery. But in interviews and social media posts, Chris shifted the focus. "This isn't about me," he said in a candid video. "It's about all of us. When you see someone in need, don't just watch. Be the person who steps up. That's how we make a difference." His words sparked a wave of conversations online, encouraging people to reflect on their actions, or inactions, in moments of injustice. The hashtag #StepUp trended for weeks, a call to action for a world too often content with looking away. For Chris, it wasn't about being a hero. It was about being human.